Hi, my name's Paul Grogan, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you how to play Galactic Cruise. In Galactic Cruise, you and up to 3 other players are supervisors at a company offering luxury cruises in space. The CEO of the company is retiring in 3 years and looking for a successor. Will it be you? Over the course of the game, you will send your workers to the various departments, constructing new ships and adding new segments to them, gathering resources, scheduling cruises, selling tickets to guests, and developing new technologies. Once everything is in place, you will launch your ships, which will then visit various destinations, allowing the guests to enjoy themselves, earning you points. Over the course of the game, cubes will be placed on the progress track, with an end-of-year meeting once each section is full. After 3 years, the game ends and final scoring takes place. A big thank you to Kinson Key Games for sponsoring this video, but I also rely on the financial support of my Patreon campaign to keep the channel going. So if you want to support me directly, you can do so at patreon.com/gaming rules. This video covers the rules for the 2 to 4 player game. For the solo game, check the relevant section in the rulebook, or if I get a chance to do a solo playthrough, I will put a link to that in the description of this video. For your first game, or when teaching new players, I strongly recommend using the introductory setup. I'm going to cover that first, and then I'll cover the standard setup at the end of this video. Place the game board in the middle of the play area. Use the side with everything pre-printed on it. Place the market board to the right. Shuffle the agenda cards and place them face down next to the main board. Then reveal the top 4 of these cards and place them on the agenda spaces like this. From the progress track tiles, take the ones you need based on how many players you have. We're setting up a 3-player game, so we need these tiles. Flip them over and place them into the corresponding spaces here. Each of these represents 1 year. In a 2-player game, place one of the neutral cubes into the Year 2 progress track. In a 3 or 4-player game, place neutral cubes into each of the progress tracks. In the company goal section of the main board, place a tracker onto the bottom space of each of the tracks. In a 2-player game, place the trackers in the middle row instead. Take the technology tiles and choose one at random. Flip it over and look at the section corresponding to the number of players in the game. In our 3-player game, we're going to use this section of the tile. Take a number of neutral developments as shown in the section. The image here is a map of the game board. Place those developments onto the indicated areas. The first will go in the second technology area, placed onto the leftmost space covering the icon. And the second goes in this area, again placed over the icon. Return the technology tile selected to the box. In a 2-player game, leave the rest of the technology tiles face down nearby. In a 3 or 4-player game, return them to the box. Shuffle the blueprint tiles and place them in the tray above the main board here. Ensure the tiles show their blueprint side facing forward. Take 5 tiles from the front of the tray and place them onto the indicated spaces like this. Take the trays for the cockpit tiles and the engine tiles and place them above the main board here. From these tiles, create 4 new ships by taking an engine and a cockpit and placing them onto each of the spaces like this. Ensure that the cockpits are this side up, showing the -5 points, and that the engines are showing their bonuses. Take the guest bonus tokens and choose 3 at random, returning the other 2 to the box. Place those tokens at random onto the guest bonus spaces at the top of the marketing board. These indicate the type of bonus provided by each type of guest. In our game, the adventurous guests provide money, the relaxation guests provide resources, and the families provide ads. If playing with fewer than 4 players, place a marketing board overlay on the bottom section here. And if playing with 2 players, also place a second overlay here. Place the marketing tray above the main board. It should contain the guests separated by type and the cruise tiles. From the cruise tiles, remove the 3 starting ones which depict a star in the corner. Place these tiles at random onto the top 3 spaces of the marketing board. Then fill the remaining spaces on the board with cruise tiles from the tray. In our 3-player game, we have 2 more spaces to fill. These cruise tiles are the current cruises that our company has to offer. For each destination depicted on the cruises, take a matching guest from the supply. Here, for example, we have 2 orange destinations, 2 purple destinations, and 3 teal destinations. Depending on the number of players in the game, there is a minimum amount of guests needed at the start. 7 for a 2-player game, 9 for a 3-player game, and 11 for a 4-player game. If the number of guests you've just taken is less than the required number, take 1 more guest of each type, even if that puts you over the minimum number. And if that still isn't enough, repeat the process. In our game, for example, we have 7 guests and needed 9, so we take 1 more of each. We now have 10, which is enough. Randomly place these guests one at a time, starting with the first section of the queue here, then the middle one, then the top one. Then go back to the first section, and so on. Repeat this until all guests are placed. Place the resource trackers on the number 2 space of the storage silo. Place the 2 trays containing the money and adds within reach of the players. Each player chooses a colour and takes all of the components in that colour, as well as a player board, a resource tracker of each type, a set of 8 upgrade tokens, and a starting cockpit and engine indicated by the stars in the corners. Place your player board in front of you and place the resource trackers in the number 1 space on each of the resource tracks: food, oxygen and fuel. Place your developments on the last 3 spaces of each row. Place your 2 workers in your break room. This is what you have at the start of the game. Place your expert workers in their spaces here and here. You can unlock these during the game. Place your brown upgrade tokens onto the corresponding spaces here. The one depicting money goes over the money space, the one depicting ads goes over the ad space, and so on. Place the grey upgrade tiles this side up here. Which one goes where doesn't matter. The player who most recently went on a cruise, either in space or at sea, is the start player. Give them the first player token. Place your cockpit and engine to the left of your board. The cockpit should be showing the side with -5 points, and the engine should be showing the side with all of the bonuses depicted. Whenever you gain a new engine during the game, you gain all of the bonuses printed on it and then flip it over. So let's do that now for the starting engine. You start the game with 10 money, 2 ads, 1 agenda card drawn from the top of the deck, and reputation based on where you are in turn order. The first player starts with 0 reputation, the next player clockwise starts with 1, and so on. Mark your starting reputation by placing your tracker on the reputation track on the main board. Also on the main board, each player places their scoring tracker on the 5 space on the scoring track. Each player places 3 of their progress cubes onto the matching spaces above the company goal on the main board. Place the rest of your cubes near your player board. The cruise consultants are placed on the matching space on the marketing board. Then, beginning with the player to the right of the first player and going counterclockwise, in other words in reverse turn order, each player does the following 2 things. First, take the leftmost development from any of your resource tracks, let's say that you choose the one from the oxygen row, and then choose an area on the board where there is no developments already present. Place your development onto the space depicting the reputation icon, and for doing this, you gain 1 reputation. Note that it is not allowed to place your starting development onto a technology space during setup. Next, take a blueprint from the offer and place it to the right of your player board. Do not refresh the offer at this time. Once all players have taken a blueprint, slide any remaining tiles down and then refill the spaces from the tray. Finally, give each player an employee handbook, which contains loads of useful information for them to refer to during the game. And with setup complete, you are now ready to play. But if you're playing with 2 players, there are a few extra steps of setup which you need to do, which I'll cover later in the video. Galactic Cruise is played over a series of rounds. In each round, the first player will take a turn, followed by the other players in clockwise order. This continues until the end of the game is triggered, which happens when the progress track is filled with cubes. At that point, you finish the current round, and then each player gets 1 final turn. Then you perform final scoring, and the player with the most points wins the game and becomes the next CEO of Galactic Cruise. However, as mentioned earlier, the game is divided into 3 years, and when the first progress section is filled with cubes, there is an annual general meeting, or AGM for short. That happens at the end of that player's turn. You do not wait until the end of the round to have an AGM. Your turn consists of 3 steps which are summarised on the back of the employee handbook. Step 1 is advance ships. In step 2, you either assign a worker, launch a ship, or call a meeting. And in step 3, if you've done well enough, you can accomplish a company goal. And even though step 1 of your turn is advancing your ships, this only happens if you have a ship in space. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to skip that part for now and come back to it later. Let's start with assigning a worker. One of the 3 options that you have available to you in step 2 of your turn is to assign a worker, and you will be doing this most of the time during the game. To do this, take a worker from your break room and place it on one of the 6 locations on the main board. You can place it onto an empty location, or you can place it onto a location occupied by another player, bumping them out. You are not allowed to place it on a location where you already are. I'll explain more about bumping out other workers later on. Once you have placed your worker, you get to perform up to 2 actions that you have access to, as depicted here on your player board. Each location has 2 actions. You can do the same action twice, or you could do each action once. But that's not all. If you have a development that links you to an adjacent location, those actions are also available to you. For example, you really want to acquire some more blueprints, which is this action, but you cannot place your worker there because you are already at that location. No problem, just place your worker here and then use your development to perform the action that you want it to. You can even perform both actions from the location that you've linked to. It's not required to perform any actions in the location where you placed your worker. Developments only link to an adjacent location. So if you place a worker here, you have access to these 4 actions. Even though you have a development here, the link does not extend beyond adjacent locations. It's even possible to use another player's development at a price. For example, if you place a worker here, you can use Pink's development to link to these actions. The cost of doing this depends on your reputation. At the start of the game, the cost is 2, indicated here. Once your reputation is 7, the cost becomes 1, and once your reputation is 15 or more, you are so well liked by the other employees of the company that they let you use their developments for free. The cost of using somebody else's developments is paid from you to them, not to the bank. If you use a neutral development, the money goes to the bank. But what if there's more than one development in an area? Do you choose who to pay? I'm afraid not. You have to pay both. For example, you place a worker here. You have access to these 2 actions and also to these 2 because of your development here. The fact that there is another player's development there does not matter. However, if you want to access these actions, you must pay both Pink and the bank for access. Money is tight in the game, so I would recommend against paying too much to use other people's developments early on. I'm now going to go through each of the 12 different actions. When you're performing your 2 actions, you must completely finish one of them before doing the next. And remember, you can do the same action twice if you want to. The first action I'm going to explain is acquiring blueprints. One of the main things that you're trying to achieve in the game is building ships and then sending them off into space, along with guests. And in order to add space into your ship for those guests, you will need blueprints. With this action, you simply take up to 2 of the blueprints on offer at no cost, and you place them to the right of your player board. You are limited to a maximum of 5 blueprints. If you ever have more than 5, you must discard down to 5 at the end of your turn. Place any discarded blueprints on a discard pile next to the tray. After your action is done, slide any remaining blueprints down and refill from bottom to top with new ones from the tray. But what if you don't like any of the blueprints on offer? As shown here, you may lose 1 reputation to reset the offer. To do this, move your reputation tracker 1 space backwards. If you have no reputation, then instead of losing a reputation, you lose 1 point. But if you have no reputation and no points, you cannot choose to lose a reputation. Once you have lost your reputation, or your point, choose any number of blueprints on offer and discard them. Then refill empty spaces from bottom to top with new ones from the tray. Blueprints do not slide down when performing a reset. The option to reset the blueprints can actually be done at any time on your turn, even before you place your worker and choose your actions. So for example, you're thinking of taking blueprints, but you don't like what's on offer. You could lose a reputation, reset the offer, and then if you still don't like what's there, you can change your mind on where you were thinking of placing your worker and do something completely different. And if you really wanted to, although I've never seen this happen myself, you can choose to reset the offer multiple times on your turn, losing 1 reputation each time you do so. So how do you know which blueprints to take? Well, when you're first learning the game, don't worry too much about it, because there isn't a right and wrong answer. It all depends on a number of other variables. The cost in money to build a blueprint is shown on the left side of the tile, and the points it's worth at the end of the game is shown below. The purple points icon means end of the game. You can see that the more expensive segments are worth more points at the end of the game. But also, each segment caters for either 1 or 2 types of guests, and the segments that cater for 2 types of guests are more expensive, but they are more versatile. Remember, there is no cost to take a blueprint, only to build it. Which brings me nicely onto the next action that I want to explain. This action allows you to build up to 2 ship segments. To do this, choose up to 2 blueprints from the right side of your board, pay the cost printed on them, and then flip them over to the other side. Then pick them up and move them to the left side of your board, slotting them into an existing ship by moving the cockpit tile up and then adding in the segments. Once built into a ship, segments cannot be removed. Later on in the video, we'll see how you can launch a ship into space, and when a ship is in space, you cannot add any segments to it. If you have more than one ship, you can split your builds across your ships. Remember, the points depicted on each segment will only be scored at the end of the game. The maximum size of each ship is 3 segments. The cockpit and the engine are not segments. Notice the artwork at the top and bottom of each segment. Once you have built 2 segments into a ship, the artwork lines up and you now have 1 cabin suitable for 1 guest. If you have a ship with 3 segments, there are 2 cabins and therefore space for 2 guests in total. Note that the artwork on the segment touching the cockpit and that touching the engine are not cabins, and you cannot store guests in those. As we've just seen, building segments into your ships is a 2-step process. First, you need to acquire the blueprint, and then you need to build them from your own blueprint collection into your ships. However, each player is friends with someone who works in the blueprint department, and if you buy them some kind of gift, they will give you early access to the blueprints. This is represented by the icons to the right of the blueprint offer. When building segments, you can choose to build either or both of your segments directly from the offer. If you do this, you must pay the cost of the blueprint as normal, but then you must also pay the extra cost shown to the right. To build the tea room, for example, will cost a total of 3 money. And because the other players don't appreciate you jumping the queue, you lose 1 reputation. You can have a maximum of 3 ships during the game, and this is the action that you use to acquire a new one. To do this, take a cockpit and engine pair from the display and place them to the left of your player board. Ensure that the cockpit is showing the side depicting -5 points, and that the engine is showing the side with the benefits. Immediately gain all the benefits depicted on the engine, and then flip the engine tile over. There is no cost to acquire a new ship. After taking your new ship, take a new cockpit tile and engine from the trays and place them in the display. You do not need to slide the remaining ones down. You may be wondering why you would want to take a ship that is already worth -5 points. Well, the first time that a ship is launched, you will flip the cockpit tile over, meaning that it is no longer worth -5 points. And each ship that you have will score you points each time it launches and at the end of the game, based on its unique scoring criteria. This is why the points icon is both brown and purple, points during the game and also at the end. These are all fully explained in the Employee Handbook. For your first game, all of the iconography on the ships might be a little bit overwhelming, so don't worry too much about it. Once you get to know the game, you'll have a better idea of which cockpit to take. Launching a ship into space requires a certain amount of the 3 resources: food, oxygen, and fuel. And there are 2 main ways in the game to get these resources. The first is the Gain Supplies action. This action allows you to do either or both of the following: spend 1 money to gain any 2 resources, and spend 1 money to gain 2 ads. To gain resources, simply move your resource trackers to the right. You are limited on how many of each resource you can store based on how many developments you have removed. And remember, you can perform the same action twice on your turn. For example, if you really needed lots of resources, you could place your worker on this location, perform this action twice, spending 1 money for 2 resources and optionally 1 money for 2 ads, and then doing the same thing again. The other main way of gaining resources is this action. Notice the icon here. This refers to the silo on the main board. And you just take any 3 resources from the silo. These resources are already owned by the company, so you don't have to pay for them. For each resource you take, move the corresponding tracker down 1 space and add the resource to your board. Note that you can only take resources from the silo whenever you see the silo icon. Every other time you gain resources, you just add them to your board. Now that I've explained the silo, it's time to explain this action, which allows you to refill the silo. To perform this action, you must discard an agenda card from your hand for no effect. I'll explain agenda cards later on, but all you need to know is that when you discard one, you place it face up on the discard pile in the top left corner of the main board. After doing that, you choose any 1 resource in the silo and move its marker to the top. For each space it moved, you gain 1 money. And because everyone else is happy about a full silo, you gain 1 reputation, no matter how many spaces the marker moved. Next, I'm going to talk about how you build a development, which is done using this action. Choose one of the rows on your player board. You will build the leftmost development from that row. Here, you can build either this one, or this one. The cost to build a development is depicted below the column. 5 for anything in this column, 6 for this column, and 7 for this column. But the cost isn't necessarily just money. As shown here, you can pay some of the cost with resources corresponding to the row. For example, here you want to build this development, which costs 6. You can either pay the cost with 6 money, or 5 money and 1 food, or 4 money and 2 food. Once you have paid the cost, remove the development from your board. You now have more space to store resources. You then place your development either in an area of the network or below one of the technologies. Either way, you cannot place your development in the same area where you already have one. If you place your development onto a space depicting this icon, you immediately gain 1 reputation. Having more developments in the network gives you more options when choosing your actions. And remember, you have 2 actions on your turn, so you could place a worker here, build a development as your first action, and then use that development to link to this location and perform your second action from there. If you place your development below a technology, that technology is considered to have been invented, and you gain the benefit of it for the rest of the game. And remember earlier when I said that you can pay other players to use their developments? Well, this is also true of technologies. Here, the yellow player has invented the space elevator. If I, as the blue player, want to borrow that technology, I can, by paying yellow 2, 1 or no money, depending on my reputation. In a 2 or 3 player game, one of the technologies starts the game already invented. If a player wants to borrow that technology, they pay the bank. And if there is more than 1 development below a technology, you must pay each of them if you want to borrow the tech. I mentioned in setup that you only have 2 workers available to you at the start of the game, but you have 2 expert workers waiting to be hired. This action allows you to hire one of them. You can hire this expert worker by paying 2 money for each development that you still have in your food and oxygen rows. So here the cost would be 10. But if you were to wait until later in the game after you have built some more developments, it will be cheaper. Here the cost would only be 4. The cost to hire this expert worker is 3 money for each grey upgrade token that you still have in your launch tower. So at the start of the game this will be 12. But later in the game, such as here, the cost will be 6, as there are 2 tokens remaining, even though one of them has been flipped. When you hire an expert worker, move them to your break room. But notice this icon here. This is a funding bonus. Whenever you place a worker into your break room, you gain a funding bonus. I'll explain these later on. Expert workers are placed on the board just like normal workers, except that they have a special ability. This is determined by the expert worker tile, which is different each game. For the introductory game, you gain a funding bonus each time your expert worker bumps another worker out of their location. You start the game with 1 agenda card, and I will cover how you play these later in the video, but you can get more of them with this action, 2 of them to be precise. Each time you gain an agenda card, you can either take any of the ones on the display, or you can lose 1 reputation to take the one from the top of the discard pile. You may not, however, take a card from the discard pile that you have previously played in the same turn. When you take agenda cards, add them to your hand. You can hold a maximum of 5 at the end of your turn. If you end up with more than 5, either play any excess or discard them. And again, I'll explain how you play agenda cards later on. One important thing about taking agenda cards is that the display does not refill after you take your cards. Any empty spaces remain that way until someone chooses this action, which is to refill the agenda cards. When you perform this action, you first gain any visible bonuses from the empty agenda spaces. So here, you would gain 1 reputation and 1 money. Next, discard any remaining cards in the display. And finally, refill with new cards from the deck. Should the deck ever empty during the game and you need to draw a card, shuffle the discard pile to create a new deck. Okay, so we've seen how you get a new ship, how you take blueprints, build those segments, gain resources, and all sorts of other stuff. But there is one other action that you need to do before you launch, and that is this one, schedule a cruise. To perform this action, choose one of the available cruises that has not already been scheduled by someone else. Immediately gain the benefit of the space next to the cruise, and then place your cruise consultant on that space. Of course, we've covered over the icon by placing our consultant on it, but let's take another look at it before we placed our consultant there. This icon indicates that you gain the bonus printed on any one of your upgrade tokens, and then you flip the token. You have 8 upgrade tokens in your launch tower at the left of your board. The brown tokens have a smaller immediate benefit, but a better long-term effect. This one gains you 1 money, this one 1 ad, this one 1 point, and this one a resource. Whereas the grey tokens are a better immediate benefit, but no long-term effect. This one gains you 4 money, this one 4 ads, this one any 4 resources, and this one allows you to immediately build a development with a discount of 4 money. After gaining the bonus, flip the tile over. This side of the tile will be explained later on. Once you've scheduled a cruise, you cannot change your mind. So this is the only action that you cannot choose to do twice in the same turn. In fact, you cannot do this action again until you have launched, at which point you can then schedule another cruise. The final action to explain is to advertise to a cruise, essentially selling tickets to guests waiting in the queue. Before I explain this action though, I just wanted to mention something important. Although it can be beneficial to do so, you do not have to perform this action before launching a ship. When you do launch, there is something called a last-minute sale, which allows you to quickly sell tickets just before you take off. But if you do choose to advertise, select a cruise which has at least one empty guest space. You can select a cruise that has your consultant next to it or one that has not yet been scheduled. But you cannot select a cruise that somebody else has scheduled. You could advertise to this space, even though one ticket has already been sold, there is still one space remaining. But let's say you want to advertise to the cruise which you scheduled. For each empty guest space, you may pay ads to entice a waiting guest to buy a ticket. It costs 1 ad to advertise to a guest in this section, 2 from this section, and 3 from this section. If there are no guests of the type that you want in the queue, then, as shown here, you can spend 4 ads to take one from the supply. Let's say we just want to advertise to one guest, the purple one. We spend 1 ad and move the chosen guest to this space here. For each guest that you place, you gain the benefits printed in this box. First, you gain 1 money for each destination on the cruise. The coloured diamonds with images of guests inside are destinations, whereas the ones with the stars represent a day in space. This cruise has only one destination, so each guest who buys a ticket will gain you 1 money. Next, for each guest where there is a matching destination, you gain 1 reputation. Here you have advertised to a purple guest and there is a matching destination, so you gain 1 reputation. As another example, yellow has scheduled this cruise and wants to sell some tickets. They only have 2 ads, so they advertise to these 2 guests, 1 family and 1 adventurous guest. Each guest pays 1 money per destination. There are 2 guests and 2 destinations, so that's 4 money. There is a family destination on the trip, so yellow earns 1 reputation for the family guest, but not for the orange one, as there are no adventurous destinations on the cruise. Remember, you can advertise to a cruise which has not yet been scheduled, and doing so does not mean that you are obliged to actually put that cruise on yourself. For example, this is an epic cruise, 3 destinations and a day in space. You could spend 2 ads to advertise to these 2 guests, placing them here. For each guest you get 3 money because there are 3 destinations, and 1 reputation because there is a destination that matches. That's a total of 6 money and 2 reputation at the cost of 2 ads, which is really good. The fact that those guests might still be sat there at the end of the game because nobody scheduled the cruise is not your concern. I mentioned earlier on that it is allowed to place your worker in a location where somebody else already is. Doing so bumps them out. The player who is bumped out returns their worker back to their break room, and as mentioned when I talked about hiring expert workers, whenever you place a worker in your break room, you gain a funding bonus. A funding bonus is represented by the hand icon, which you can see on your brown upgrade tokens. At the start of the game, your funding bonus is either 1 money, 1 ad, 1 point, or 1 resource. The grey tokens are not funding bonuses. And gaining a funding bonus does not flip the tile over. That only happens when you schedule a cruise. We saw earlier how these tiles can get flipped. Once a brown tile has been flipped over, it's no longer possible to take it as a funding bonus. However, and we'll see this later on, but whenever a ship launches, the upgrade token is removed, and look what's underneath, a better version of the previous funding bonus. This is why I said that the brown tiles have a weaker immediate effect, but a better long-term effect. If you ever gain more than 1 funding bonus at the same time, you can choose to take the same bonus more than once. And remember, it's not allowed to bump out your own workers. Before moving on, let's just take another look at the expert worker ability for the introductory game. If you have an expert worker and you use them to bump out another worker, that player gets a funding bonus as normal, but so do you. In step 2 of your turn, instead of assigning a worker and performing actions, you can call a meeting. If you have no workers available to you in your break room, this is your only option. First, return any workers from the main board back to your break room. For each one returned, gain a funding bonus as normal. Then you get to perform 1 action. You can choose any of the 12 actions as long as you have a development adjacent to it. Here, for example, you can choose any of these 6 actions. And this is another reason why having more developments in the network is a good thing, to give you more choice of actions whenever you call a meeting. You cannot pay other players to use their development when calling a meeting. You are allowed to call a meeting even if you have workers already in your break room if you want to. You don't have to wait until you've placed them all on the board. And if one of your workers is currently on a cruise, they do not attend the meeting as they are busy flying the ship. You start the game with one agenda card and there are a few ways to get more. The main one being this action, which allows you to take 2 new cards. Agenda cards can be played in one of 2 ways, either for its ability, shown here, or as a resource, shown here. Once played, place the card on the discard pile. You can play an agenda card for its resource at any time on your turn and it does not count as an action. And you actually have 2 options. You can either play the card to simply gain the resource, moving the corresponding tracker 1 space to the right, or you can use the card as the resource when you need to pay a cost. For example, you want to build this development. The cost of doing so is 5, paid for in a combination of money and food. You only have 2 money and 2 food, but you could use this card as if it were a food, even though you don't have the space for it. If you play a card for its main ability and there is nothing in the top right of the card, then you can play it either at any time or, in some cases, at the time listed in the ability. However, if there is an icon in the top right, you can only play the card when you are doing that particular thing. For example, hiring bonus can only be played when you are hiring an expert worker, and last minute purchase can only be played when you are launching a ship. It is possible to play multiple agenda cards at the same time, as long as they are all applicable, either when playing them for their main ability or using them as resources. And also, many agenda cards break the normal rules of the game. That's just how they roll. The third option available to you on your turn is to launch a ship, but everything has to be in place before you do this. Let's go over the pre-flight checklist. You must have scheduled a cruise. However, it is not required to have pre-sold any tickets to guests, so this is okay. You must also have a suitable ship, one that has at least 1 cabin, which means having at least 2 segments. And you're going to need some resources. Exactly how many, we'll find out soon. To launch a ship, take a worker from your break room and place them at the bottom of your launch elevator. You will then perform a series of steps, moving your worker up the elevator as you go, following the icons carefully. And whilst all of these icons might seem scary at first, you will soon get used to it. And all of the steps are explained in detail in your employee handbook. One word of warning though, even when you think you know the game well, still follow the steps here carefully so that you don't accidentally miss one. First up, T-5 seconds to launch. Choose one of your available ships. It must be one that is still on Earth and that has at least 1 cabin for a guest. Next, take the cruise tile that you scheduled and place it above the cockpit of your chosen ship. Then return your cruise consultant back to the space on the marketing board. Now that the consultant has been returned, you are now allowed to schedule another cruise from your next turn onwards. You don't need to wait until your current cruise has finished. Next, it's time for the guests to get on board. The guests can come from either the spaces next to the cruise, i.e. the ones that have been pre-sold tickets, or you can do a last-minute sale to get them from the queue. A guest taken from the pre-sold ticket spaces is simply moved to a cabin on your ship. If you want to do a last-minute sale, spend the same amount of ads that you would normally spend to gain the guest, 1, 2, 3 or 4, and then move them directly to your ship. The bonuses that you get for pre-selling them a ticket do not apply to last-minute sales. If you have a ship with 2 cabins and there is only 1 guest with a pre-sold ticket, you can take that one and then also do a last-minute sale to get another one from the queue. If there were 2 guests that had a pre-sold ticket but there was only 1 room for them on the ship, or for some reason you chose not to take them and sell the ticket to somebody else, you lose 2 reputation and move the guest to the back of the queue, where they start complaining. Certain game effects will allow a ship to hold more than 2 guests, but only 2 can be pre-sold tickets. The rest must come from last-minute sales. Next, T-4. This step is really simple. Take a progress cube from beside your player board and place it into the next available space in the progress track. If there are any spaces in the first year, place it there. If not, place it in the next one, and so on. You'll see later on just how important these cubes are, and each time you launch, you get a cube. T-3. Time to spend the resources that you need. You need 1 food per guest on the ship, plus another food for the pilot. You need 1 oxygen per segment. Remember that the cockpit and the engine are not segments. And you need 1 fuel for each fuel icon on the cruise itself. And remember, if you have any agenda cards with resources on them, you can use those as well if you want to. And there's a third way to get the resources you need, which I'll mention later on in the video. At T-2, you score the points for your cockpit. Your starting cockpit is worth 1 point per segment, so here that would be 2 points. But it's for all of your segments across your entire fleet, so here it would be worth 5 points. As mentioned earlier, all of the other cockpits are explained in the employee handbook. Then, if this is the first time that you've launched this ship, flip the cockpit over. Notice that the -5 points is no longer there. Remember that upgrade token that you flipped over when you scheduled the cruise? Well, at T-1, you move that token to the engine of the ship. In our case, it was a grey token, so the cost of hiring this expert worker is now cheaper. But if it was a brown token, then one of your funding bonuses is now better. And finally, T-0. Move the worker to become the pilot of the ship, and we have liftoff. Remember that when you call a meeting, any workers that are currently piloting a ship are not returned to your break room. After launching, take a new cruise from the tray and place it in the empty cruise space on the marketing board. Note the types of destination on the new cruise. For each type of destination shown, move the matching guests all down one space towards the front of the queue. Any guests already in the bottom section do not move. Then add a number of new guests to the top section of the queue. The number of new guests added is equal to the number of guests who just got on the ship that had launched, in our case 1. The type of guests added are based on the destinations on the new cruise. In this case, if only 1 guest just got on the ship, then a family guest would be added. If 2 guests got on, you would add a family and an adventurous guest. And if 3 guests got on, you would add a family, an adventurous guest, and then another family. Now that I've explained the 3 options for step 2 of your turn, I'm going to go back to step 1 of a player's turn, which is advancing ships. Advancing ships only happens if you have any ships in space, which is why I skipped over this part earlier on. But if you have any ships that have launched, then this is the point when they fly through space. First, move the pilot to the next stop of the journey. There are 3 types of stop: days in space, destinations, or returning to Earth. A day in space is an opportunity for your guests to explore your ship. The more segments that you have that match their needs, the better. For each guest, determine how many things there are for them to do on your ship, which is simply counting the number of matching icons on your segments. Then, gain the bonus corresponding to that type of guest a number of times equal to the number of things they have to do. For our ship, we have 1 purple guest, and there are 2 things for them to do. And purple guests in our game provide resources, so we gain 2 resources. But let's look at a more complex example. Here you have a ship with 3 segments and you've used a special ability to add an extra guest to your ship. You have 1 adventurous guest who is very happy because there are 3 things for them to do. In this game, the bonus for adventurous guests is money, so you gain 3 money. These 2 families, however, are not so happy. There's only 1 thing for them to do, but there are 2 of them, so you get 2 bonuses. And in this game, the bonus for families is ads, so you gain 2 ads. This might seem a little complex at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. For each guest, count how many matching symbols there are, and that's what they give. When your ship arrives at a destination, your guests leave the ship and explore. And one thing I find useful to mention when teaching the game is to focus on saying the guests leave the ship, which means all of those icons which we just saw being counted for a day in space, well, they don't apply when the ship reaches a destination because the guests have left the ship. Personally, and this isn't in the rulebook, but I like to temporarily take the guests off the ship and place them above my player board, just to reinforce this. The first step to resolve when you arrive at a destination is whether you want to drop off your upgrade token currently on your engine. If this is the only destination on this cruise, the answer to that is always yes. But if there is more than 1 destination, you may choose not to drop the token at the first one and wait until the next one. If you do decide to drop the token off, remove it from your engine and place the token onto one of the 3 spaces for the type of destination that you are at. Doing this gives you a special upgrade for the rest of the game. Each upgrade is fully explained in the employee handbook. Each destination is worth a minimum of 3 points to each guest who visits it, plus another 1 for each upgrade token. But even though the guests have left your ship, you need to try and convince them to go on these additional excursions, which means you're going to need more advertising. If the guest matches the destination, it only costs 1 ad to persuade them to go on the excursion. If the guest doesn't match, it costs 2 ads. For example, our ship with one adventurous guest and 2 families arrives at a destination suited to families. You choose to drop off your upgrade token, unlocking this special ability, but also making the destination worth 4 points. You spend 2 ads to get the 2 families to go on the excursion, earning you 8 points. If you wanted to persuade the adventurous guest to go there, it will cost you another 2 ads and you gain another 4 points. After visiting the destination, return the guests to your ship. The final type of stop is the return to Earth, always found at the end of the journey. Place your worker back in your break room, gaining a funding bonus as normal. Remove the cruise tile and place it next to the marketing tray. And return all of the guests from the ship back to the supply. Ships can be reused multiple times over the course of the game. Remember though, to only flip the cockpit tile the first time that they launch. Do not flip it back to the other side when they launch for a second time. And if you have multiple ships in space, then in step 1 of your turn, you get to advance each of them in an order of your choice. The single most important thing about everything that I've just said in this chapter is that this is step 1 of your turn. Advancing your ships is not your action. You still have step 2 of your turn where you can choose one of the 3 options. And one of those options could be to launch a ship, the same one that just landed, and with the same pilot who just got back. The final step of your turn is to check to see if you have accomplished one of the company goals. Each game there are 3 different company goals determined by the company goal tile. If you meet or exceed the current requirement determined by the position of the goal tracker, you remove your cube from above that goal and place it into the progress track. Once you have done this, move the goal tracker for that goal up 1 notch. This sometimes makes it harder for the next player to accomplish. Note that in a 4-player game, once the tracker reaches the top, this is the requirement for both the 3rd and 4th player. All of the company goals are explained in your employee handbook, but I'm going to go through the 3 used in the introductory game now. This goal is for having a number of developments on the board, either in the network or on technologies. This one is for having complete sets of icons in segments on your ships. For example here, you currently only have 1 set of icons, but if you build this segment, you now have 2 complete sets. And this goal is for having dropped off an upgrade token on the indicated number of different destinations. Now, I don't normally like to give strategy tips in these videos, but achieving the company goals is a big part of the game. It's something that you should look at right from the start. The more you achieve and the earlier you do so, the better. Earlier in the video, I briefly mentioned that there was a 3rd way to gain the resources you need if you are short, and that is done through the reputation track as indicated here. And it's not just resources that you can gain from here, you can gain money or ads too. At any time on your turn, even when in the middle of doing something else, you can lose as much reputation as you want, moving your tracker backwards. Then choose one of the 3 types of bonuses: money, ads, or resources. For each matching icon that you crossed when moving your tracker back, gain 1 of that bonus. For example, you are about to launch and you desperately need a food and a fuel. You don't have any agenda cards in hand, so you move your reputation tracker from here to here and you choose to gain resources, gaining you what you need. And like when using agenda cards for resources, you don't actually need the space to store these resources, you just get them at the instant you need them. As indicated here, you can only lose reputation like this once per turn. And before moving on, if your reputation is ever at 18 and you would gain more, you gain 1 point instead. And if you are ever at 0 reputation and lose a reputation, you lose 1 point instead. If you have 0 reputation and 0 points, you cannot do something that would cause you to lose reputation. As mentioned earlier, the progress track is the timer for the game, and it's divided into 3 years. At the end of a player's turn, when the first progress section is filled, there is an AGM, an annual general meeting. Each player scores points based on the number of their visible wings, multiplied by the number of cubes they have in section 1. At the start of the game, each player has 1 visible wing, but will gain more as they accomplish the company goals and remove the cubes from here. As indicated here, the player or players with the highest reputation are considered to have 1 extra cube. For example, blue and pink tie for the highest reputation. Blue has 2 wings and 2 cubes, plus a bonus cube for being tied for having the highest reputation. They score 6 points. Yellow has 1 wing but no cubes, so they score no points. Pink has 1 wing and 1 cube, plus a bonus cube. They score 2 points. After the AGM, carry on playing with the next player's turn. At the end of the turn in which the second section is filled, resolve the second AGM. This is done in the same way as the first, except that it counts cubes in the second section only. The end of the third year is handled differently. When the last cube is placed in section 3, the end of the game is triggered, but you keep playing until the end of that round so that all players have taken the same number of turns. From this point, any cubes that would be added to the progress track are placed here. After you finish the round, you then resolve these 3 steps. First, all players return their workers not currently in space back to the break room, gaining funding bonuses as usual. This is not calling a meeting, so you don't get to perform an action. Then, in turn order, each player performs one final turn. And then finally, for each ship that you currently have on a cruise, you can advance it to any one future stop and resolve that stop as normal. So here, you can advance this ship to here, here, or even return home. And once you've done that, it's time to proceed to final scoring. The end of the game scoring is all printed above the progress track. First, each player adds up the number of resources they have, any remaining money, ads, agenda cards still in hand, and any blueprints. Divide the total by 3 and round down, and then score that many points. Next, perform a third and final AGM. This is done in the same way as the first 2 AGMs, but it counts all of the cubes in the third section of the track, including any here. Next, score points based on your final position on the reputation track. 15 points if you have 15 reputation or more, 8 points if your reputation is between 11 and 14, or 3 points if your reputation is between 7 and 10. Next, score points for each of your segments. You then gain points based on how many developments that you have removed from your board. If you have removed all of the ones from this column, you score 5 points. If you've removed all of the ones from the first 2 columns, you score 15 points instead. And if you've managed to build all of your developments, you score 30 points. Finally, each of your cockpits score one final time, in the same way as they did when you launched them. Remember that any ship that didn't launch counts as -5 points, but you still score them for their own criteria. The player with the most points wins the game and becomes the new CEO of Galactic Cruise. In case of a tie, the tied player with the most cubes on the progress track breaks the tie. If still tied, highest reputation, and if still tied, the one with the most points gained from cockpits wins. And if still tied, the player later in turn order wins the game. Once you've learnt the game, try the standard setup, which is different from the introductory setup, as follows. Use this side of the game board without the pre-printed features. Take the action tiles, shuffle them, and place them at random onto the 12 spaces in the network. Take the expert worker tiles, choose one at random, and place it onto the space here. Return the rest to the box. Take the technology tiles and choose 4 at random, placing them onto the spaces at the top of the board. Choose one of the remaining technologies at random to use to determine where to place the neutral developments based on the number of players. If you are playing a 2-player game, leave the rest in a stack. Otherwise, in a 3 or 4-player game, return them to the box. On the progress track, do not place any neutral cubes into the slots. Take the company goal tiles, choose one at random and place it here. Place the trackers on the bottom space or on the middle space for a 2-player game. When setting up the cruises, just shuffle the ones with stars in with the rest of them and deal them out at random. The rest of the setup remains the same, but the game will be very different. I've already mentioned some changes that are needed for a 2-player game, but there are more. Remember to only place a neutral cube into the second section of the progress track if playing the introductory game. Also remember to place the company goal trackers in the middle row. Additionally, during setup, take 6 developments, 2 workers and 2 expert workers from one of the colours not being used and place them nearby. Place the 2 workers in the locations clockwise from the neutral developments. These are known as NPC workers. During the game, when you bump out an NPC worker, move it to the next location clockwise. If that location was empty, the worker remains there until bumped out again. But if you bump out an NPC worker and the next location clockwise is occupied by another NPC worker, skip that location and move to the next location clockwise. If an NPC worker moves to a location that contains your opponent's worker, that worker gets bumped out and your opponent returns them to their break room, gaining a funding bonus as normal. If the location contains one of your workers, it is not bumped. Instead, skip that location and move to the next one. An exception to this is if you have unlocked this ability on your player board that allows you to bump your own workers. In this case, an NPC worker can bump you out on your turn. During the game, NPC workers will become experts. These work in exactly the same way as normal workers, except when they are bumped, they skip over empty locations unless there is no other option. The NPC player will also do something at the end of the first AGM as indicated here. First, replace one NPC worker with an expert worker. Choose the one closest to the top middle location and go in clockwise. Then, shuffle the set-aside technology tiles and choose one of them at random. Look at the image on the tile for the two-player game and place 3 NPC developments on the board in the locations indicated. Return the technology tile used from the game. At the end of the second AGM, do the same thing again, replacing the other NPC worker and placing more developments. If there was already an NPC development in that area, skip placing it and instead return it to the box. The rest of the two-player game is played as normal. I hope you found this video useful in learning how to play Galactic Cruise. If you want to see a full 3-player playthrough, I've got one of those too. You can find links to it in the description of this video. If you have any questions about the game, please leave them in the comments. And whilst you're there, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more content. And as mentioned earlier, I do rely on the support of my Patreon to keep the channel going. So if you are in a position to be able to do so, please visit patreon.com/gaming rules for exclusive access to the Gaming Rules community and some extra bonus content. Until next time, take care and thanks for watching.